like everything is going down the drain. The amazing thing is, particular things are going very well. There are miracles taking place right now on Earth. Most people are in a state of hope. You won't notice it in the West because of what we see. We're all freaking out in the West because we're losing control in the world. But heaps of people made tremendous progress in the last couple of decades. Like hundreds of millions got out of extreme poverty. They're planning. They have money to spend for the first time in history. So they're on the road of, so what are we going to do? What is the next generation doing? They're all in the state of planning and hoping for opportunities in the future. We're at the state of having little to gain and lots to lose. Well, that's not the best position of being optimists and planning for the future. So we're very much in the state of defending, protecting what we have, rather than planning for the future. And so that's a weird combination on Earth. We usually think that the rest thinks like us, but the rest thinks very different. We are the ones now being weird because we're the ones freaking out while a lot of things go very well on Earth. Now, at the same time, of course, there are these global issues that require collaboration and we need to figure out. So what I want to do is take you on a journey across the globe, major trends, and I will try to give you some positive trends and some concerning issues. But we try to balance it because you need to be available for your cooperation in the rest of the day, so we don't want you to be totally freaked out at the end, right? Here we go. Is this working?
I think so.
Yeah? So thank you for listening to the Dutchman. I'm here every second month, and I am in a 50% role as Chief of Vision here in World Vision Australia, and I'm a senior advisor to the other fundraising offices of World Vision, which are 20, more and more in emerging economies, which is very interesting. Like the Asians are smiling, their smile gets bigger and bigger because there's more and more revenue now coming from Asia than from Europe and North America. So it's an interesting, we can see it in our organization, the shift from the West to the East, even in terms of donors. Just one comment about that. It's interesting to see that a first middle class stage doesn't create donors. People getting out of extreme poverty, they're just very happy that they have a living, that they have a house, but they're still in a very vulnerable state because if they lose their job, they can slide back into poverty. So they're not concerned about the rest of the world. They're very busy with securing, consolidating what they have. Now we can easily interpret that as materialistic, but basically their state is very vulnerable. It might look like they have a nice apartment and they might have a job, but they can lose it all. This is why some countries like China, they save 40% of their income. Because they don't have a backup system. So that's the first stage. But if you go to the next stage, you will see countries like Korea, where there's a much more stable middle class. And the interesting thing is, it's not like they stay in that securing stage. No, the interesting thing is at the next stage, they start thinking about others. And the interesting thing about Korea is there are a lot of people now saying, others people help me to get into this stage of a stable middle class living. Now I want to do something for other people. So what we see is next stage, there will be donors and people becoming more solidary with others. So don't just focus on the first stage of people getting in the middle class, because that easily leads in the West to this judgment like all these Chinese are materialistic and they're all only caring about their material wealth. Well, there's lots of work to secure your middle class standing. And the next stage can be more going out and widespread. So let's see what happens with the world once there is a middle class growing and getting more stable, not only in China but also in India, because that might give a whole new dynamic to social impact, to solidarity across the globe. So here's the 3 trends I would like to address with you. Positively named: peace, sustainability, solidarity. Climate change inevitable in the middle. The unfortunate thing about climate change is that it is hitting the weakest, the most vulnerable. If I want to be a socialist, I would have wished that actually climate change would have led to a nice redistribution of wealth, right? So the rich would have to work a little bit harder because of climate change, and the poor would have it a bit easier. Well, unfortunately, it's the opposite. The poor get it more rough, and the northern hemisphere, unfortunately not Australia, but the northern hemisphere, actually fertility can even go up of the ground. The yield of the ground can even go up in the northern hemisphere. Yeah, we have a little bit more floods, maybe sometimes a bit more difficult, but not that difficult. The real difficult areas are Southern Hemisphere, especially Africa, and also Australia. So not fair, unfortunately, but that's what we face. Good news when it comes to the middle one, it's getting expensive to waste and to pollute, and so what we see is a lot of pragmatism around this. It's good, it's getting costly. It's always a good argument, right? When it gets costly to waste, well, people start thinking differently. When it comes to peace, major power shifts in the world, making only one group of people pretty nervous, and that's us. At the same time, there's heaps of major issues that require collaboration. So what you see is a weird combination of power shifts, making some nations nervous, more introvert, more protectionistic. At the same time, there's a planet shouting for collaboration. We don't care about your nationalism. Please help us to avoid pandemics in the future. Help us to avoid tackling the nuclear risks that we face, the trafficking, the heaps of issues that require planetary collaboration. At the same time, the sentiment, especially in the West, is close the curtains, pretend the rest of the planet doesn't exist. So that's a weird combination. Solidarity, the inequality in the world is decreasing. I will give you the numbers, but it's increasing in countries. Yeah? So you see a greater gap in countries, but on the whole, the world has improved tremendously in terms of inequality. So there's a weird thing that we have civil unrest in countries, more and more countries actually being oligarchies, with a couple of very wealthy people, calling the shots. I think that's the expression. And at the same time, on the whole, it's going quite well. So we'll tackle that. There is a rise of the middle class because of this tremendous progress that we made. There's a new middle class, and the good thing about a satisfying middle class is that they are a stabilizing factor in politics. Satisfying middle class people will support boring politics, because they basically support politics that defend the status quo, because it was the status quo that brought them into their middle class situation. So the biggest supporters of the Communist Party are middle class people in China. What if the middle class gets dissatisfying, gets unhappy? Then they become the most dangerous people in society. The biggest threat to global peace right now is the Western middle class. Don't be afraid of the Chinese or the Indians. Be afraid of the Western middle class. They're freaking out right now. They are getting the feeling that the world is not supporting their situation anymore. And the more dissatisfying some of the Westerners become, the more open they will be for more extreme solutions. And they will move to the far left and the far right in the political spectrum for solutions. If they will be satisfied, they will be happy with central political parties, just being in the middle, status quo. But if they get dissatisfied, they move to the left and to the right. So what you see right now is more to the right, because the left can't promise golden mountains anymore, like in the past. So we move to the right. Most of the West moves to the right, because the right is about preserving, conserving, protecting law and order, etc. So what you see is a move to the right, but the more dissatisfying Western middle class people become, the further we go to the right. And then we also get in unhealthy parts of right-wing politics. And so that's what you see right now, and you can really hope that we find a way back to the middle in time with our middle class people. Because, I'm coming from Europe, we know what happened 100 years ago, right? If a middle class group gets really angry, then you know what can happen. So how can we make sure that middle class in the West actually develops a new kind of solidarity to avoid too many angry people in their own society? We get to that. So let's move to, there's three things to keep in mind, and then we just complete the picture here. When it comes to peace, global power shifts need to collaborate. There are of course two factors to take into account: global issues and national issues. The big question for the future is, which of these two will be more dominant? Will the global issues force us to collaborate in the world? Or will we still think that we can get away with focusing on national issues only? We can't predict that, because it all depends on how dominant the global issues will be. If there will be a pandemic causing millions of casualties, we will be forced to start collaborating, and the global issue will be more dominant than national issues. As long as there are not these kind of dominant global issues, we can afford to simply be nationalistic. Nationalism is a luxury. Nationalism is the luxury of not hearing a planet shout enough, loud enough. It's just, okay, so the global issues are not dominant enough, so you can afford being a nationalist. But nationalism is a luxury. Why on earth do you think that you can fix the future or secure the future just by being nationalistic? Do you really think that's the solution for the major issues that we face today? It's a luxury. Apparently you can still afford taking that position. But let's wait what happens in the future. Of course, an obvious one is economy versus ecology. And then there's, of course, mankind versus technology, because, yeah, there's automation and there's robotics disrupting our labor market. So where do we still need a human being in the future? And well, that whole dynamics between human beings and technology, who's calling the shots? We don't know yet. That's still to be figured out. So can you imagine, this is all happening at the same time. These are all different issues. You know what the problem with us is? Mentally, we find it difficult to deal with all of this at the same time. Usually we pick one and get angry about it. Right? Just pick one. Build a whole political party about everything is about sustainability. Just make everything about sustainability. Solutions, greener. Anything, greener. Or, no, it's all about China becoming too powerful. We need to defend ourselves in the West. Everything is about power shifts. So we usually focus on some of these issues. The mental challenge that we face in the future is that all of these issues are very important and we can't ignore any of them. So the mental challenge of the future is, how can you consider all of them and not freak out? How can you consider all of them, not in a pessimistic way and think, oh no, we can't find a solution, it's too big. You know, you can have this mental fatigue, it's too big. How on earth are we going to do this? How can we still have a sense of taking action, possibility thinking, while considering all of this? I think one of the secrets is, if we keep it balanced, we're not losing sight of the good things that are happening right now. Stay focused on good developments, and that might give you the energy to also tackle the more concerning elements. But you need to keep it balanced. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'll give you good news and concerning news. When it comes to global power shifts, you will see, this is a fascinating graph. Do you like graphs? I love graphs too. This is one from the University of Groningen, which is of course a Dutch university. University of Groningen, they did this kind of nice exercise. So they said, okay, let's estimate in the last 2,000 years, what was the share of GDP for each country in the last 2,000 years? It's an estimation, of course. But they tried to find out, so of course there wasn't global trade 2,000 years ago, but what would have been, you know, the share, the percentage of GDP, wealth created by each country? And if you look at 2,000 years ago, you will see that 70% of that wealth was created by two countries only, China and India. And here's the thing, that lasted for 1,800 years. Because here is 1800. And then you suddenly see a disruption, you see a game changer being what? US? Yeah, US itself was not a game changer. No, this was reference. It was industrialization. But the US was one of the ones benefiting the most from that, right? So what you see here, the game changer is industrialization. This here in this stage, 18th centuries, it was the population size that determined your, you know, the amount of wealth you could create. But then suddenly you had industrial power, and industrial power could give you much more wealth, even with a smaller population. So what you see is these dwarf nations like UK and France being very small compared to India and China. They suddenly could become very powerful. It helps if you conquer a few other countries, right? So they did use their industrial power to also oppress others. That they seized the moment. So what you have was like France and Britain having almost half of the world with their industrial power. And they simply were benefiting from the fact that they had a head start. They could industrialize before others did. And of course, they abused their power to prevent India from industrializing. Basically, they destroyed the industry of India. The Chinese had a horrible 200 years because agriculture couldn't keep up with population growth. So they had hunger, they had civil wars, they had 200 years of misery. And then, of course, the Westerns coming in, imposing on them opium and that kind of stuff. And so it was 200 years of misery for both India and China. And so what you could see was, basically, that gave the West a party of 200 years. We could, for 200 years, we could pretend we ruled the world and we were the ones setting the terms in global economy. But now, of course, we face a stage where India and China start to industrialize. And now they have both benefits. Now they have an industrial power and their population size. So what you simply see is they're going back to the old places they had in the world order. And what you see is not something new right now, but we're going back to the old world order. The old world order that existed for 1800 years in the last 2000 years. And so for the Chinese, knowing their history very well, nothing new under the sun. This is what we're supposed to be, the biggest economy, if you would only look at the size of our population. Same applies to the Indians. Once they have their industrial or post-industrial power in order, of course they will be the biggest. It's just a matter of size. Enough customers, enough labor force, it's all of that. So what you see right now is they are going back, and just for your information, they have a petrol machine engine and they have a diesel engine. So they're a bit slower, but don't give up on them if it goes a bit slower. They need to do a lot of homework. They're more democratic, they're more authoritarian. That helps to go through shifts, right? So what you see is they go a bit slower than that, but they will come up and they will dominate the economies of the future. So what you see is, according to the World Bank, this is Dutch, you're all fluent, right, in Dutch, no problem. China, well, that's recognizable. China, India, this is according to the World Bank in 2050, the biggest economies. China, India, United States, Brazil, Japan, Russia, Mexico, Indonesia. That's the G8. Germany, United Kingdom, France. Interestingly, if some of the Europeans have it their way and the European Union explodes or implodes, and there will be not only Brexit, but Nexit, Frexit, Crexit. If you have all the exits that you want, and there is no European Union, there will be no European countries sitting at the table when the G8 gathers in 2050. What you will have is 3 giants and a couple of dwarfs in the rest of the world. But there will be only 3 giants: India, China, United States. Only if the European Union manages to survive itself and stays together, there will be a 4th giant. So this is the consideration for the Europeans and the European Union members. So what do you want to be? A proud dwarf or a united giant? That's the consideration. And the interesting thing is we're so freaked out, we prefer dwarfness, right? For the sake of national pride. Interesting. So that's going on in the West. What we have here is, if you add it up, of course we need to leave out these people. They got confused. They left the building, perhaps they come back, I don't know. But if you add it up, you will have a pretty high bar, and it will be the 4th one. And here's the Australians. You can still join us. You do already with the Euro Song Festival, so why not with the European? So what we have here is, this is the state of the world a couple of decades from now, and you can see it's a huge reshuffle of power. Huge. Can you imagine all the colonial powers being dwarfs? That hurts. That hurts. You know, we won't just, the West is not in a position right now, it's not mentally there to simply give up power. So the big question for now is, can this transition of power happen peacefully? History doesn't make us optimistic because usually this provokes war. But let's hope there are so many global issues that require collaboration that we will find the peaceful way forward. But this is a very tricky transition that we face right now. Here's another thing. Loss of economic power is loss of ideological power. This is not a painful thing for the West. If you lose economic power, you don't control other people's thinking anymore. If you're powerful enough, other nations will adapt to your political preferences. So if you want democracy and you're powerful enough, then it will be too costly for the others to contradict you. It doesn't help you with trade, so you adapt, right? Now it's the other way around. Now Google adapts to the authoritarian regime of China to sell its product. So what you see now is there's a transition in power leading also to a transition of ideological thinking. And what we see right now is more and more countries being authoritarian according to Western standards, And they can get away with it because the West is not powerful enough to stop them. So what you have with China being simply too big. You know, some countries are too big to franchise. You can't simply recreate China in your own image. It doesn't work that way. Too big, and they know it. And they also know that whenever the West talks about human rights and it becomes too costly, they stop talking about it. Right? As soon as it's costing us money, any principle is negotiable. So what we have is China being too big, and so yeah, the world sees that they can do it their way, they can have their own political system, and we don't stop them. Same with Russia. Russia has gas. 40% of energy in Germany depends on Russian gas. So Putin can steal the Crimea. Nobody will stop Putin, because we need the gas from Putin. And he has 7,000 nuclear warheads, which also helps, right? So he has this huge leverage, and he can get away with being an emperor or a czar. And nobody stops him. Why? Too expensive. We lost the economic power to control Putin. We lost the economic power to control Xi Jinping. So we can't do that. Same with even Turkey. They have heaps of refugees. We don't want these refugees to move into European Union, so he can be authoritarian. We won't stop him. All of these things simply show that we're shifting in our thinking. The West doesn't control thinking in the world. And so the world, in the decades to come, will not be as Western democratic as the West would be it to be. We will shift. We will move more to the East. We will become more collectivistic, less individualistic in our thinking. There will be more collectivism in our thinking. We will be less tolerant to deviating individuals and say, adapt to the group, rather than having this endless individual authenticity that allows us to do it for everyone to do everything what they want to do. We will be less tolerant to individual deviations and focus more on group interest in the future. Why? Because the economy is now being on the rise, they think that way. And so we will adapt. And the interesting thing is, this will go in small steps, so you won't notice it. And you might find yourself a couple of decades from now suddenly in a different state and discover that you are thinking in a way that you couldn't imagine when you were in your 20s or in your teenage years, because the world is moving step by step. We will get to another factor as well later on that is in line with that. Here's another thing that we need to deal with. I'm giving you heaps of different issues so that you will just be overwhelmed, right? Because the exercise of today is simply, these are all the issues and they're all play at the same time. So this is the mental exercise. They're all at the same time. Here's another thing. In the past, we had a very clear sense of peace and war. There were times of peace and there was time of war, and it was almost cute how clearly distinct these two areas were. There was a moment where one neighboring nation would say, I'm going to hit you. And then the other nation would say, wait a sec. And then they would stand all opposite each other, a nice piece of grass, and then they would ruffle on their drums and then would start having war. And then actually they would start hitting each other, but in a nicely organized way. I'm going to hit you, wait a sec, all sitting there. Then they would start hitting each other, and then one would lose, and then that would be the moment of surrender, and that would be the end of the war. Very clear, a paradise of clarity. You know exactly when there was war and when there was peace, right? Now, that kind of war is almost non-existent on Earth. We hardly have international wars anymore, with a nice beginning and a nice ending. We hardly have them on Earth. We have hardly casualties of these kind of wars. What we have right now is this awful, blurry thing called terrorist attacks or lone wolf attacks, whatever these people want. And you have these unpredictable kinds of violence where some guy or group suddenly decides to become violent. And you don't know where, you don't know when. There's no announcement, I'm going to hit you. Nothing. Simply, now I'm fed up and now we're going to strike. And so, suddenly, we have no distinction anymore between a time of war and a time of peace. So now the big question is, what are you going to do mentally? You can do two things. You can say, wow, what a wonderful time we have entered. There are hardly international wars. There are hardly casualties of war right now. You know, the number of suicide victims is much higher than the number of victims of war these days. You're a much bigger danger to yourself these days. More people die of suicide than of war. So what you have right now is a very peaceful time, very peaceful time in terms of wars. And what you can tell yourself is, well, that is wonderful. Actually, it has never been so peaceful on Earth. Or you can say, yeah, but anytime, anywhere, there can be a terrorist attack. We have to be on alert. You know, this is a kind of wartime because actually there can always be an attack. Well, good luck. You will be in war for the rest of your life because it won't stop. So what do you want? Do you want to focus on the terrorist attacks, which is actually a quite small chance that you are being hit by a terrorist? Or do you want to focus on the time of peace in which we live? Now these are kind of mental things. What we do right now is we get freaked out over this very small chance of being hit by a terrorist. In my country, the chance that I'm being hit by a terrorist is 0.0001%. The chance that I kill myself is 2.5%. So I'm a much bigger danger to myself than any terrorist in the world. But that's not how we take it, right? We don't believe it that way. Actually, we rather believe that there's a huge chance we are being hit by a terrorist because they were also in Paris, they were also in London, they were also in Istanbul. So one example of a terrorist attack and we all freak out. Well, this is exactly how terrorists rule us, right? So this Harari, the writer of Homo Deus, he said there's only one way to stop people from doing terrorist attacks, and it's ignore it. Don't pay attention to it. The fun is gone for the terrorist if we're not freaking out over it anymore. Because then it becomes more and more expensive for them. They're killing themselves and we don't care. Right? If we can have that kind of mentality, the terrorist attacks will lose their value. But not right now. So here's a huge mental thing here. We have a different way of dealing with violence and we need to get used to it. Now, positive, on the positive side, there's huge need to collaborate, but we also have good examples of successful collaboration. We eradicated smallpox in 1980 because we decided we want to end smallpox as a global population, and we did. You know, there was this vaccination available to end smallpox, and we said, let's do it with all people in the world. We did, and there's no smallpox. Smallpox is was one of the major death causes in world history. We just stopped it. Why? We decided. Incredible. Development goals, almost all countries, if not all countries, involved in development goals. The good thing is these were the millennial goals, mostly cooked up by the West. That's when the West still ruled. The sustainable development goals are much more the result of conversations between all countries, especially the emerging countries. So you see already a change in power in how these development goals were designed and drafted. Of course, we have the Paris Agreement, even more countries, 195 countries involved. Of course, they need to stick to it, especially the Western giant on the other side of the ocean. It's a vulnerable thing because it's only an agreement. But at least we have 195 countries signing and saying, yes, we want this. At least you have the word. Now let's hope for the action. But it's a good sign we can get to joint words, right? Ozone layer, CFCs, it is restoring, it's slowing down a bit because there are new factories producing CFCs. But what you see is a restoration of the ozone layer since 1987 because we decided to stop production of CFC. So what you see is also development there. We can do amazing things if we decide to join forces as a global community. We just have to decide and stay on it. Here are some uplifting issues that we also need to deal with right now, and it would be great if we could come up with similar agreements on this one. It's a bit of a depressive list, so I put a vineyard behind it to do some pastoral care here. I told you, you need to be available for your company the rest of the day. So what I have is this vineyard, but these are major issues. Now they're not all of them are already disasters. Some are risks, right? And they can never happen. There's a chance it never happens. So nuclear risks, leaking power plant in Japan, that's not a Japanese problem. That stuff gets into our North Sea in the Netherlands. So it gets everywhere. So it's all of our problem that something is leaking in Japan. There's of course, did you know that all nuclear power plants were built in the same period, and so they all get old at the same time? Now they all get old at the same time, especially the ones in Belgium. So we in the Netherlands, we need to watch how they are not maintaining their nuclear power plants well enough, so there's trouble with these things. So this is what we see right now. There's maintenance, we have these kind of things, and it's not only a national thing, it's an international thing. Of course, we have unstable countries with nuclear warheads, migrations, human trafficking, scarcity of raw materials, refugees, pandemics, drinking water, cybercrime, international crime, slavery, global terrorism, climate change. Bad advice. If you want to be a really successful criminal, anyone? Really successful criminal, be in 20 countries at the same time. Why? Because there's no international police. The countries in the world refuse to collaborate in having a proper international law enforcement entity. We don't work together in chasing criminals across borders. So if you want to be a successful criminal, don't stick to one country. Just have buildings and networks all in 20 countries, and there's no police chasing you. Same with verdicts, with a legal system. We don't have a proper international legal system because that thing in The Hague is not recognized by the major powers of the world. So there goes your judge for international issues. So what we have is, we didn't set things right on the international level when it comes to law and law enforcement. So that needs to be solved. Heaps of things. Just to give you an impression of where World Vision is involved, actually in most of them. World Vision is in 100 countries, involved in most of these issues. We're not that ambitious. Nuclear risk is for someone else. But criminality is also to be solved by others. But heaps of different things. Human trafficking, major problem in Southeast Asia. World Vision was involved in the development of the Hanoi Action Plan. Ever heard of that? 6 countries in Southeast Asia, from Thailand to China, deciding to work together to fight human trafficking. Because the problem with human trafficking is they're on the move. So if they cross the border, you lost them. So how do you chase human traffickers? By making sure they can't get away by moving across the border, and then there will be another office or country, and they should just equally chase that person, and then the traffickers are in trouble. So what we have right now is 6 countries working together to fight human trafficking. Now that's promising. That's awesome. So that's the kind of thing that requires international collaboration. Refugees, 700,000 Rohingyas having no home. They cross the border and still there's no home, there's no solution. So what do you do? Well, that can only be solved internationally. Well, heaps of things. Still 14 million slaves. So yeah, big things. Let's move to the next one. Not very uplifting, but this is the one I really can't make nicer than it is. This doesn't look good, and it is not good. If you look at this, you will see that these are the countries that can cope the least with climate change. So it's not who's being hit, it's who can cope with climate change. Because you are being hit as well in Australia, but you are rich enough to some extent to take the hit. These are much more in trouble, these countries. Now the problem with that is that these are also the countries where the poorest people live. The more yellow, the poorer. These are also the countries where most people will be born in the future. So this is a time bomb. Climate change hitting the poorest, where the most people will be born in the future. That's not a good combination. That's really horrible. That means there will be a lot of humanitarian need in the future coming out of these areas. And I don't know what to do. There are different things you can hope for. Technology that can suddenly help them to get water from the ocean, turn it into drinking water and electricity. We'll get to that. So you may hope for some technology, but this is really a tough one. Really tough one. Here's another thing. When over 35% of the population consists of youngsters, there's a 150% higher chance of an armed conflict. Guy from Oslo saying that. Just statistics. Where are the youngsters? Where are most of the youngsters in the poorer countries? Well, this is the median age graph. As many people above that age as under that age, and you will see this part is pretty young. Very young, actually. This part has the median age is in their 20s, people in their 20s. And you see there's a lot of that. And you also see that's the area where a lot of extremism is born. Now why is that? The problem with these countries is they're economically functioning well enough to get you through your first 20 years. You know, you're not starving from hunger. You will have a job, you will have shoes, you'll have water, you will have education. You will get to your 20s. But then the economy is not functioning well enough to give you a job. So what you get in these countries is people being old and educated enough in their 20s to know perfectly well how hopeless their life is. Right? That makes you angry. That's hitting your dignity. As a man, you won't find a wife because you can't maintain your family. There's all kind of humiliating things to this. That's where people get angry. An economy functioning well enough to get you in your 20s, not functioning well enough to give you a perspective in life. And you see exactly, that's the part. This is the miserable strip where a lot of terrorism is born. Now, it so happens that this is also a Muslim strip, but I can tell you, if there would have been heaps of communists preaching the communist revolution, they will probably have all been socialists. And they would have hoped for the communist revolution. It's just a matter of whatever radical solution you can hope for in that kind of part of the world, right? So what they're looking for is an extreme version of the ideology that is available in their region. And it is the Muslim version. But we in Europe, we have the red version. If we would have heaps of Muslims in Europe, we would have all hoped for paradise. But we were all hoping for communist revolution in Europe. It just happens to depend on where you live, what your hope and your radical solution will be. So this can only be solved. This is not to be solved by making sure they have water or shoes or education. This can only be solved through economic development. If you want to stop extremism in this part of the world, make sure they have a job. Make sure they have the dignity of participating in society. And that's up to us. You know what we do? Instead, we demonize this strip. And we say, you know, this is where all the lousy religions are, and where all these extremists are. We need to make sure they can't get out of the country and get into our countries. You know, instead of helping them, we demonize them. Well, if you want to make them more angry, demonize them. Right? The only way for solving this is to include them in the global economy, make sure they can economically develop, and make sure they get a job. There's no other way. So, on the positive note, some pragmatism is going on. It's getting expensive not to be sustainable. So, of course, we have more profitable solar cells, quickly rechargeable batteries on the rise. Deforestation is slowing down. That sounds like you're trying to say something positive, but it doesn't. It's not that positive. Well, it is quite positive. The Chinese government is spending heaps of money on planting trees. And if China does it, I can tell you, it makes a difference in the world. Brazil is making progress, even though it's not perfect yet. India, especially Indonesia, is making progress. So what you see is several countries really investing in reforestation, and that's good news. It needs to be zero at the end. We need to have a zero deforestation, but we are getting there because we are becoming aware of it. Sustainable agriculture in developing countries, what we do is, in a lot of countries you see that we skip industrial agriculture, the wasting part of industrial agriculture. We try to become sustainable in those countries straight from medieval agriculture straight into sustainable agriculture, skipping a waste stage or a pollution stage. And that's good news. Actually, that's the aspiration of China as well. Wants to be #1 sustainable agriculture. Why? Because it's also pragmatism. You don't need a Bible verse for that. It's just very simple. It will cost you money if you don't have the most cost-effective way of agriculture, especially in China. And China has only 10% of the global available agriculture. And it has almost 1/5 of the world population. It has a tiny piece of land to feed 1.3 billion people. So it needs to be very, very efficient and sustainable. Now, I put my money on this one. I love this one. Turning salt water into drinking water and electricity. That's the silver bullet. The issue is we have already technology turning salt into sweet water, but it can only be used by countries that have heap of energy, because it costs very much energy to do it right now. So which countries do that? The countries at the Persian Gulf, of course. They have no problem. India can do it, Israel can do it, I think your country does it. So you can do it if you have enough energy available. If you don't, you're in trouble. So what if this electricity and drinking water technology becomes available? Suddenly also the poorer countries can do it. And they can suddenly, we have new agricultural opportunities if this technology becomes available. And there's heaps of salt water. Most countries are situated at the beach, at the oceans. So we have heaps of salt water that can be turned into drinking water and electricity, giving heaps of new opportunities. If you want to start doing business with this kind of technology, I think it's the University of Ghent, Belgium. Ghent, they are working on this technology, and I'm sure others will follow because this is promising. But this is good stuff. It means we're not doomed to see the water wars come true, right? It's not necessarily so that the lack of drinking water in the future will lead to major wars. There may be some tricks, technological tricks, that may suddenly change the whole perspective. Let's hope for that. Okay, let's move to the last one, solidarity. Here's the miracle that I would love to share with you, the miracle that took place in the last 200 years. 1800. Most people, 94% of the people, 200 years ago lived in extreme poverty, also in Europe. Everywhere on earth, most people, 90% lived in extreme poverty. And that was the situation in all of world history. That was the normal situation. And can you imagine what happened in the last 200 years? 1975, red is Asia. As you can see, Asia basically decides on where the world is. Most of Asia was still in extreme poverty in 1975. Only a couple of decades later, most of the people, and see, it also has a growth of population. The population grew and moved out of extreme poverty and in a situation of having $5 to $10 a day. What's the difference between having $1 per day to spend and $5 to $10? $1 to spend means you're happy you survived the day. There's no way you could plan or do anything. You're just happy you didn't die. And now let's hope you don't die tomorrow. That's the survival mode of extreme poverty. But what if you have $5 to $10? Now you have an investment capital. Now you suddenly can think of an education for your child. You don't need early marriage anymore. You don't need heaps of children to do child labor. You suddenly can plan for them. You can have education. You can even have a loan, microcredit. You can even suddenly start to lend a sewing machine to start your own business. That's what happens when you get out of extreme poverty. There's a little bit of money that you can spend, invest, and immediately it means you can be hopeful for the future and you can start planning. Now, if you look at the amount of people that move from the left to the right, you will see that the dominant sentiment on earth is hope. And it's only us being which? Being the yellow and the green. It's this thing here that is freaking out. So this one is in a state, this huge amount of people are in a state of hope and planning. This has seen no progress, as you can see. They are the ones now having little to gain and lots to lose. So only this graph will immediately show you what the sentiment distribution on Earth is, right? There's this, was it Mosey? There's this sociologist, and he looked at the world through the lens of emotions. And he said that Asia is characterized by hope, the West is characterized by fear, and the Middle East is characterized by humiliation. He didn't say so much about the other things, but this is actually pretty accurate if you look at what is going on and how people stand in the world. Now, this looks very good. There's only one problem, and that is in countries you see growing inequality, leading to a situation where 1% of the world now has more wealth at its disposal as the other 99%. Now, no problem with people being rich, really. That's not in itself a problem. The problem here is that these very, very rich people also happen to have political interests. And they would love to influence who's actually in the White House, and who is in the Kremlin, and who is in control in Beijing. So what you see is that this 1%, or some of this 1%, have political interest and start interfering with politics, and it creates a shadow force. A force that is outside of the checks and balances of our democracy. And that's a problem. Because suddenly you have the usual formal democracy choosing its leaders, and then you have this shadow force of very rich, powerful people actually having a lot of influence on the choice of the politicians, and nobody's checking them. It's just their personal interest that counts. So what we see is China, US, India, Russia, all being oligarchies. They're They are all run by the very wealthy. And what you see is that that it is undermining democracy. It's making people lose trust in democracy, because it's not democracy deciding on who's getting in the White House. It's just this game of wealthy people supporting campaigns. And so if you get into that play, you see it's undermining democracy, because it's a shadow force. And so we need somehow to fix this. This is not something we can let happen, that a few wealthy people in the world actually decide on who's in control, and then have a formal system just being a farce, just being, you know, a puppet game. We can't have it. So, now just to add to your list another issue, but this is one. Here's some other things that we need to take into account when it comes to solidarity. The issue that we face right now in the world, and especially in Western societies, is that it's very difficult for us to be one society. We're split up. We're divided. There's a lot of segregation, if not apartheid, in Western societies. Some people just live separate lives and don't meet. There's an education gap. There is a job gap. People with job, with no job. There's a generation gap. There's what else can you have? A religious gap. There is, and of course there's an immigration gap. People living longer and shorter in Australia, because that's your situation. People being older and younger immigrants in your country. And the one thinking that they are more entitled because they are senior immigrants. So that's an interesting situation, and the problem is not so much that there are differences, because democracy should be able to absorb differences. The problem is the people don't meet. They don't understand each other. They just live different lives, and because they don't meet and they have their own Facebook bubble with the like-minded people liking already what they didn't say yet, because you're all living in your own bubble, we don't understand, and we fill the gaps with imagination. And so we have very spooky ideas about Islam and about particular groups coming in, and we think we understand them because we don't talk to them. It's very easy to know the other if you don't talk to the other, right? So it becomes much more complicated if you start talking and you actually see that it is a human being with very similar needs and emotions and things. It becomes much more complicated. So don't talk, just assume. Assume. And that's what we do. Identity politics, you know, all that. Just assume you understand the other, you can fire away. And so that's a problem. We need to unite the countries again. So where's the people that select people's representatives? Where are they? What's the uniting thing here? Here's another thing, and that is globalization, automation, and robotics are deeply disrupting the labor market right now. You know, and the secure jobs we had in the past, they either move to another country or they're made redundant because there's a machine doing it. Automation, robotics. So you may know World Economic Forum saying within 3 years over 7 million jobs will globally disappear. This is a major disruption. This is like the old world order of labor forces is not functioning anymore. So what you get is a transitional stage. Because of course, if you lose jobs here, a robot will also create jobs, right? It's not only a vacuum. But here you see jobs being created based on automation and robotics, and here you see jobs being lost, and never coming back. And then of course the big question is, can the people losing their jobs here fill the vacancies here? And no, they can't, all of them. Some of them can, but not all of them. This may be a higher educated, this may be lower educated. You may see that there may be a huge gap between the loss of jobs here and the new creation of new jobs there. And some people may not be able to cross the bridge. And so what happens is, there's a growing group in Western society that is losing their job and never getting employed again, because they can't do the transition to the other jobs that are becoming available. They're losing and not becoming a winner on the other end. And this is something we need to solve, because this is creating a humiliated group in society. You know what we do with this group? We're telling them they're only costing money because they're benefiting from the social system. So rather than looking for new ways for these people to participate in society, to have a dignified way of being valuable in society, we tell them you're costing money, you're an expensive, how do you call this? What is a nice economic, commercial term for this? You're expensive, that's it. You're a cost item. You are simply costing, you are just profiteering. You're a profiteur of the system. Well, if you tell them that often enough, and you don't give them a perspective of having another way of being valuable in society, you're creating a very angry group. That's the bottom layer of Western societies. That's where the angry middle class is growing. And we need to somehow come up with different ways of making this group feel fully valued and participating in society, even if it means without a job. So jobs in the future may not be the distinctive for being having a dignified life and a profiteering life. No, what we need in the future is, regardless of jobs or joblessness, what is your contribution to society? And that's a new way of thinking. We're definitely not there yet. We have an old way of taxpayers paying for a social system, being solidary with the poor and the jobless people. That's not what we can do in the future. In the future, we need to find ways, and of course universal income is something that is being proposed. We're not there yet. Contradictory research is about that. But it is something that we need to consider. What if you have no job, but you do make a valuable contribution to society? Can we see it? Can we appreciate it? Can we consider it part of what society is all about? New ways of thinking. Just to get back to the positive, here's 6 things that happened in the last 200 years that are just amazing. I told you about extreme poverty. 94% living in extreme poverty. It has gone down to 10% in 200 years. And most of this actually happened in the last couple of decades, after the Second World War. Incredible. What we have is basic education being only 70% in 1800, now 86. Literacy, 12 to 85%. Democracy, depending on your definition of democracy. If you include China, the numbers go up. 56% now, one only 200 years ago. Vaccination didn't exist, of course. So now it's up to 86% when you need to consider 3 diseases actually. Child mortality, dying before your 5th year. Almost half, 43%, 200 years ago, died before their 5th year. Now it's 4%, meaning you don't need those huge families because most of them will die. You can actually take the risk of having a small family. That's what happens when it drops to 4%. And actually what you see now here is more security in life. Planning. So all these things are happening right now. For the first time in history, more people die from too much food than from too little. And I'm not talking about the West, I'm talking about the world. More people die from old age than from infectious diseases. What you get now is new diseases becoming dominant because people get old. You know, you can consider cancer at old age a big problem, but actually it is because people get old. Right? It's even an epidemic now, what people call it, cancer. But it's, you know, people became 40. They didn't have a problem with cancer. They were too young. They died too young to ever have that disease. So what you see is new diseases, dementia. New diseases becoming very dominant now because of old age. More people die from suicide than from war, terrorism, or crime together, globally. Facing a criminal, a terrorist, or a soldier. Well, you're still a bigger danger to yourself. So take care of yourself. Live a healthy life, because heart diseases and cancer are the biggest health threats. And don't kill yourself. That's basically what happens today. So this is an incredibly wealthy, prosperous world if you look at this. Don't forget, if you look at all the global issues that we also need to face. What does this do? This incredible progress, it leads to a new middle class. And these middle class people are not in the West, but in the East. If you look at 2000, you will see that by far most of the middle class people lived in European Union, in the United States, or in Japan. If you look at 2050, you will see that by far most people of the middle class live in Asia, India, China. And you will see little is left of the middle class in Europe and North America and Japan. Relatively, of course. They didn't die. It's just a relative thing, right? Here you see the same. OECD, 2010, 2/3 of the middle class living in Europe and North America. 2030, 2 decades later, 2/3 of the middle class living in Asia. Just imagine, what will that do to product development? What will that do to cultural shifts? What do you think if there's a film being made in 2050, a blockbuster? It should work well in all cinemas of the world. Who do you think is the target group? Who's the testing group? the focus group, whatever you call it, that will test the film in 2050. Will it be a bunch of Europeans? Come on. Of course, they will test it with the Indians and the Chinese. If the Indians and the Chinese like it, you better like it as well in Europe. Bad news for you, the hero dies in Asian videos. It dies. Now, the more you identify with the hero, the bigger the chance the hero will die. So no happy ending. It's not a Disney World. It's not a Disney World. So if you get depressed while watching the movie, you better suck it up and get used to it, because that's what the majority of the world doesn't mind watching. So the interesting thing is, this is not an economic shift. This is a cultural shift. We will think, act, appreciate differently. We won't mind ourselves in the future to see the hero die, because that's what happens in movies. New generations won't know any better because they forgot about all the Disneys in the world. If we insist on having our own movies, of course, have it your way. We will make tailor-made movies, but you will have to pay more for it, because you're a tiny market. You're only 1 billion people, but we will make the movie for the 2.5 billion people, right? If you want to watch it, well, we have 3.5 billion, being the West and these major markets. So it's all about numbers, and if you want tailor-made Western products, it becomes more expensive, because you are a sub-market. Interesting things, lots of different things. Now we see, for a time being, we see that the East is looking and getting inspired, or finding their criterions in life by looking at the West, Western advertisement, even Western beauty standards. Give it a couple of decades and it might turn around, and the West might look for the East. Because it's all about power, about economic power, about who is controlling the products, who is the target group, the major target group for the use of tools, entities, commodities, etc. It's all about who is the first that the producers of the products of the world are looking at when they produce something. And we will start getting used to an Asian taste. It's fascinating. If you find it threatening, just decide what you find important yourself and stick to it. But you will see it will go gradually. It will go gradually, and we might not even notice it. We already have more and more Asian movie stars in Western movies. And I think already the plot is changing in some of the Western movies. Just more misery. It's interesting to see. Vision Fund is a nice indication. What we see is the amount of micro credits that we can, micro loans that we can give to people. It's a good indicator of where a middle class is growing. So it's a kind of barometer. Okay, final comment. New times, new thinking. No desirable future without a local home and global collaboration. I didn't mention one thing, which is also very important. We are not only in need of global collaboration, we're also in need of a home. And the problem we face right now is you can't only scale your thinking. You can't only think planetary. Why? Because the planet doesn't offer you a culture that you can feel home in. It doesn't have a language. It has heaps of languages, the planet. So if you want to feel at home somewhere, you need to somehow get into a local culture, preserve it, because that's the place where you feel at home. That's where you understand your neighbor. Basically, feeling at home means understanding your neighbor. What's more, predicting the behavior of your neighbor. That's when you really feel at home. If you know how the other will say good morning to you in the morning. The way the people will respond in the shop to you. That familiarity, that makes you feel at home. How do you create familiarity? By speaking the same language, they have the same norms and values, the same habits, the same ugliness, the same messiness, the same things that are typically part of your local culture. We also need to preserve that local culture to make sure people still feel at home in this world, while we also tackle the global issues. Now, if you look at the populists of today, especially in Europe, heaps of them, they're all emphasizing that local home. And they say we need a local home, we need to protect our home, we need to protect our own culture, heaps of migrants, they're disrupting our local home. Well, there's some truth in that. You can't simply widen and get more diverse, because at the end you will feel an alien in your own street. Somehow what you need is, as you recognize the global issues, as you recognize that there is migration and you can't stop it, as you recognize all that, you still need to also make sure you can feel at home somewhere on Earth. So the challenge we face here is that we need to somehow make sure that the cultural diversity on Earth is still doing its work, making people feel at home, while at the same time having that concern for global issues that require collaboration. So you can't demonize any culture, but at the same time, you need to preserve every culture. Don't demonize any culture, make sure, but don't give up on your own culture. It's that balance. Preserve your own culture, but have an appreciation and understanding of all the other cultures. Because at the same time, we need to work together with all these cultures to get the planet ready for the future. So all of that at the same time. No desirable future without a new stability based on resilience and solidarity. As we see all these issues, and I hope I gave you enough to make you dizzy, because all of this is happening at the same time, and I hope you agree that you can't simply ignore some of them by saying, well, those are not important. No, actually, all of them are actually worth considering and worth tackling. You need to consider all of them, but at the same time, you need to somehow find that mental strength to face them and not freak out. Face them, not get a kind of complexity fatigue. It's too complex, it's too big, we can't do it. Somehow you need to get that resilience to say it's complicated. Yes, we need to do a lot of things. Yes, it sounds like it's way too big, but we will move forward. We will find new solutions. We will attempt to collaborate and to also preserve that local home. We need to somehow have the resilience to keep doing it, because there's still plan B, because there's only one planet. After 5,000 years of civilization, we reached the maximum. You can't go beyond the planet without colonizing another one. This is the planet. This is the one that we need to fix. So we need the resilience to not freak out and keep making sure that our home is in order. What did Mr. Macron say? There's no planet B. He said it to the Americans. And that's true. This is it. So resilience, very important. And solidarity. They're in the transition. We face major transitions right now on the global scale, on the national scale. We can't afford to forget the forgotten ones. We need to somehow make sure that the forgotten ones in society can participate and move along with the transitions, even if they don't find a job. We need to make sure that everyone moves forward. Because if you don't, you will create an angry group in society that will be in for radical solutions and get very ugly politically. And if you want to avoid that, you need to do what we did in Europe after the Second World War, and that is you need to make sure there is a social solidarity to make sure people don't become a Nazi again, because that's the only reason why we created the welfare system in Europe. It was very pragmatic. We didn't want fascists, Nazis, and communists again, and so we created a welfare system to give everyone a decent life so that they wouldn't do that. And they would stick to the boring politicians in the middle. Right? That's the only way. If you want stable politics, you need to somehow give everyone a dignified, decent life so that people are happy with the status quo. That gives stability. Well, that requires solidarity. It also requires solidarity with that demonized strip where extremists are being born. Fragile context where you think, oh, everything is going down the drain. Why would we support them? You know, every money gets lost in corruption. Well, we might need to keep supporting them, because that's the groups where you will also see the ugliness come from. Extremists that will then make your life miserable in Australia. So somehow we need to be solidary with the fragile context and with the forgotten ones in our own society to make sure there is a sustainable future. And if we do so, and if we stay resilient, there is hope, because we did a lot of good stuff in the last decades. Let's continue doing that. Thank you.